I'm not suggesting Queen Camilla lacks authority, but that tiara isn't hers. It rightfully belongs to Catherine, the Princess of Wales, for the Christmas gala at Buckingham,
For decades, Princess Anne had been the one royal who never bowed to emotion, never surrendered to pressure, and never allowed private pain to interfere with duty. But 1 minute ago, before a stunned gathering at Windsor Castle, she accepted a final public responsibility no one knew had been prepared. Anne stepped toward Catherine, raised a historic family circlet, and crowned the Princess of Wales as the monarchy's new family leader. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. The silence broke only when Anne entered St. George's Hall, carrying Queen Mary's laurel circlet in her own hands. St. George's Hall is the ceremonial chamber inside Windsor Castle where the family marks moments of royal importance, and this gathering had been called with no warning. The Princess Royal refused an equerry, an attendant who normally carries ceremonial objects, because this burden belonged to her alone. Her hands remained steady, her jaw did not. Catherine saw the tremor immediately, while William watched his aunt cross the room and understood that this was not an honor. It was a farewell. Anne stopped before Catherine and told her to kneel. The Princess of Wales hesitated, turned toward William, and whispered that she had expected a family meeting, not a coronation. The prince gave a small nod, but his eyes betrayed the truth. He already knew. This was not a transfer of the throne or constitutional power. It was a transfer of trust, the duty to guide younger royals, steady the family during crisis, unite its charitable work, and become the emotional center of the House of Windsor. Charles had authorized it 48 hours earlier through a sealed declaration, a signed royal instruction confirming the new responsibility. The king remained seated, drained, while Camilla held her hands together so tightly that her knuckles whitened. The queen consort had received no chance to shape the ceremony, and her stillness carried more warning than anger ever could. Anne had demanded secrecy because she wanted Catherine's monarch, William, and 2 trusted officials knew the circlet would be placed upon her. When it touched Catherine's head, the older woman rested both hands on her shoulders and said, "Hold them together when the rest of us no longer can." Catherine's composure cracked. She reached up and gripped Anne's wrist. Applause followed, but unity did not. Someone in that room had already challenged the decision before Catherine arrived. To understand why Anne chose Catherine, and why that choice wounded others so deeply, the action to be real. Only the private stakes carried by every person in that room must first be exposed. The ceremony lasted only minutes, but every face inside St. George's Hall carried years of rivalry, loyalty, fear, and unfinished grief. Catherine received the circlet, yet the true weight of the moment rested on 4 people watching her. A king struggling to preserve control, a husband terrified of what duty might cost his wife, an aunt preparing to disappear from public life, and a queen who understood she had not been chosen. Catherine had entered the royal family as an outsider and survived by listening before speaking, adapting without surrendering herself, and hiding pressure that might have broken someone less disciplined. The circlet now resting upon her head was a ceremonial band used to mark honor rather than constitutional power, but its meaning was deeply personal. Younger members of the family had already begun turning to her when fear entered the room. Anne had noticed every quiet conversation, every reassuring hand, and every moment when the Princess of Wales absorbed another person's panic without asking anyone to notice her own. Princess Anne had spent most of her life performing the task Catherine had now inherited. She settled private disputes, confronted relatives others feared to challenge, and defended the standards left behind by Queen Elizabeth. The late monarch's expectations had become Anne's private code, and surrendering that role meant giving away the identity that had made her indispensable. The Princess Royal had never needed affection to perform her duty, yet as she watched Catherine rise, she understood that her own era of protecting the family from itself was ending. William had tried to hide his fear before they entered the hall. He stood beside his wife in a private chamber, adjusting his cufflinks again and again, because speaking honestly would have meant admitting that he wanted to pull her away from the burden. The prince knew Catherine had already endured years of judgment, but he also knew no one of their generation commanded the same trust. When she asked whether he believed she could carry it, the future king answered yes too quickly, then took her hand as though apologizing for what that answer would cost. Charles felt the transfer as an admission of failure. When the king signed the royal declaration, a formal written instruction giving the decision official force, he stared at Anne's name beneath his own, and realized that authority could command obedience, but not closeness. Camilla felt that truth even more sharply. The queen consort expected influence over family gatherings and private loyalties, but Catherine's elevation placed another woman at the center of reconciliation, royal children, and emotional unity. Camilla stopped Anne in a narrow corridor moments before the ceremony and asked whether the crown had decided she was incapable of holding the family together. Anne answered without cruelty and without retreat. "This is about trust, not rank." The queen walked away wounded. The older woman pressed one hand against the wall and closed her eyes, knowing her final act would create pain before peace. That hidden incident began during what should have been an ordinary family ceremony, until one crisis revealed who could command the room when royal authority suddenly failed. The decision to crown Catherine did not begin with a formal document, a palace committee, or a carefully managed succession plan. It began 5 months earlier at Sandringham, during a private service marking the anniversary of Queen Elizabeth's accession. What happened after that service lasted less than 15 minutes, but it permanently changed Anne's understanding of who could protect the family when protocol collapsed and fear took control. Charles had gathered the family for a private chapel service followed by lunch, but tension had already settled over Sandringham before anyone took their seat. Camilla, William, Catherine, Anne, Edward, Sophie, and several younger relatives knew the king planned to discuss future responsibilities that afternoon. The anniversary service marked the date the late queen began her reign, making the gathering emotionally important because every decision now seemed to invite comparison with the stability she had once provided. Anne expected Charles to confirm Camilla's expanding role through a draft schedule, a working plan showing which royal would control gatherings and representation during periods of reduced activity. Charles rose after lunch with the prepared folder in his hands. He began speaking, lost his place, and suddenly stared at the page as though the words had disappeared. The king dropped the file. Camilla called for an aide. William moved toward his father, and Edward received another instruction from across the room. Fear turned order into noise. Catherine acted before panic could spread. She guided the younger family members out, asked Sophie to remain beside Camilla, and told William to stay with Charles. She sent Edward to summon the physician privately, preventing uniformed staff from rushing through the room and turning a family crisis into a palace alarm. The Princess of Wales never raised her voice. She simply gave each frightened person one clear task, and they followed her. Anne watched Catherine kneel beside Charles without hesitation. The monarch gripped her hand and asked whether the children had witnessed what happened. She assured him they were safe, calm, and unaware of how serious the moment had become. That answer steadied him. It also changed the Princess Royal's view of the woman beside him. Camilla waited until Charles recovered before confronting Catherine in the library. The Queen accused her of taking command without permission and warned that good intentions did not erase rank. Catherine held her gaze and answered that she had not been thinking about permission. She had been thinking about the family. Anne heard every word from the adjoining doorway, and the silence that followed told her more than the argument itself. Anne later found the fallen folder beneath a chair. She placed it on Charles's desk, removed the draft granting Camilla greater family authority, and set Catherine's handwritten emergency instructions beside it. One document demanded control, the other had created calm. From that night, Anne knew Catherine had not seized leadership. Everyone had given it to her instinctively. She quietly consulted William and began preparing the transfer, but when Camilla discovered why, she demanded a private confrontation. The argument that followed was not a disagreement over ceremony. It was a brutal reckoning over trust, loyalty, and who truly belonged at the center of the royal family. 3 weeks before the crowning, Princess Anne entered a private sitting room at Clarence House and ordered the door closed behind her. Camilla was already waiting beside the fireplace, with Anne's draft declaration resting on a table. No aides were present. No secretary remained to soften their words. For the first time, the two women confronted the question the palace had avoided for years. Which of them had truly earned the family's trust? Camilla had learned through her private secretary that Anne intended to recommend Catherine as leader of the internal family council. That council was the private circle responsible for managing disputes, family unity, and sensitive decisions away from public ceremony. The Queen expected negotiation. The Princess Royal arrived with no intention of changing course. Their relationship had survived years of restraint because Anne respected Camilla's loyalty to Charles, while she believed her devotion to the king had earned authority over everyone around him. But Anne had never accepted that loving one man automatically meant understanding an entire family. Camilla pushed the declaration across the table and pointed to the sentence naming Catherine the family's first point of unity during private or public crisis. She demanded its removal. Anne read it slowly, picked up a pen, and underlined the words instead. The sound of the nib against the page seemed to sharpen the silence between them. Camilla did not hide the wound this time. She asked whether she would always remain the woman the family tolerated, but never trusted. Her voice cracked on the final word, and Anne paused. Beneath the anger, she recognized something more painful. The queen consort feared that no title, no sacrifice, and no number of years beside Charles would ever erase the family's old suspicions. Anne admitted the decision was not punishment. She did not doubt Camilla's love for the king, but she said leadership required people to feel safe enough to disagree. Too many relatives became careful, guarded, and silent whenever the queen's office entered a room. Camilla heard accusation where Anne intended judgment, and the distance between them widened. Anne then returned to Sandringham. She said that when Charles faltered, Camilla looked toward the exits, the staff, and the danger of exposure. Catherine looked toward the frightened members of the family. The queen struck the arm of her chair and accused Anne of turning one moment of fear into a verdict on her entire life. Camilla warned that crowning Catherine would create two courts, one around the king and queen.
She has broken more bones on horseback than most soldiers break in combat training. She once fought off an armed kidnapper with her bare hands, and for 4 years running, no member of the British royal family, not the king, not the heir, not anyone wearing a heavier title, worked harder than she did. Then, in 2025, for the first time since 2022, Princess Anne lost that title. And the reason she lost it says almost as much about the state of the monarchy as the 4 years she spent holding on to it. To understand why that shift matters, you have to understand what hardest working royal actually measures. Every year, researchers comb through the court circular, the official, published record of royal engagements that appears in newspapers like The Times and the Daily Telegraph, and tally who showed up where and how often. It is not a popularity contest. It is not decided by the palace. It is simply a count of who did the work day after day in village halls and hospital wards and regimental parade grounds most people will never hear about. For 2023 and 2024, that count belonged to Anne. In 2023, she logged 433 engagements. In 2024, even after a horse-related head injury nearly ended her year in June, she still finished with 457, keeping her crown despite weeks spent recovering from a concussion serious enough to erase her memory of the incident itself. Royal watchers who track these numbers, including researcher Patricia Treble, whose annual tally is now published through outlets like the Daily Mirror, have called her consistency almost unmatched in modern royal history. Then came 2025. King Charles, continuing his weekly cancer treatment throughout the year, somehow found the capacity to undertake 532 official engagements, nearly a quarter of everything the working royal family did combined, and still worked harder than almost anyone else alive with a royal title, finishing at 478, a 10% increase on her own record from the year before. But for the first time since his sister took over the top spot, the king had outworked her. It's a strange kind of story. A monarch battling cancer, somehow expanding his public schedule, and his sister, the steadiest hand the family has had for half a century, still coming in second despite doing more, not less, than she'd ever done before. What that number doesn't capture is the why. It doesn't capture what it means that the family's collective workload jumped 22% that year, climbing from just over 2,000 engagements in 2024 to nearly 2,500 in 2025, the highest total since 2022, the year Queen Elizabeth died. It doesn't explain why a king undergoing chemotherapy pushed harder rather than pulling back, or why his sister, now well past the age most people retire, kept matching him step for step. To understand that, you have to go back to February 2024, to the month everything about the working royal family quietly, permanently changed. That was the month Buckingham Palace announced that King Charles had been diagnosed with cancer just over a year into his reign. Weeks later, in March, Kensington Palace made a separate, far more shocking announcement. Catherine, Princess of Wales, was also undergoing treatment for cancer, following major abdominal surgery earlier in the year. For a royal family that prides itself on visible continuity, on always having someone standing at the gate, waving, present, this was the nightmare scenario. Two of the most senior working royals, one of them the monarch himself, were suddenly unavailable, and unavailable for reasons the palace understandably kept private for months. The public didn't know how serious it was. The family did, and somebody had to keep the machine running while the people at its center tried to survive. That somebody was, overwhelmingly, Princess Anne. Royal correspondents who cover the institution closely, Camilla Tominey at the Telegraph, Robert Jobson, who has written extensively on the modern monarchy, and Roya Nicker at the Sunday Times, have all, at different points, described in using nearly identical language, unglamorous, uncomplaining, indispensable. She is the late Queen's only daughter, born in 1950, and she has never sought the spotlight the way some of her relatives have. She holds patronages and presidencies of more than 300 organizations, stretching from Save the Children, which she has supported since 1970, to equestrian federations, to military regiments where she serves as colonel-in-chief. She was Chancellor of the University of London for decades. She competed in Olympic three-day eventing in 1976, the only member of the royal family ever to compete at an Olympic Games, and her daughter, Zara Tindall, followed her into equestrian competition at an Olympic level herself. Neither of Anne's children, Peter Phillips and Zara Tindall, carry royal titles, a decision and made deliberately, decades ago, so they could grow up with something closer to ordinary lives. It is, in its own quiet way, one of the more telling facts about her. Even inside an institution built on hierarchy and title, she chose to give her own children less of it. In 2024, with Charles undergoing treatment and stepping back from the heaviest parts of his schedule, and with Catherine essentially absent from public life for most of the year, she carried out just 13 official engagements that year, a number that on its own tells you how serious her illness truly was. Someone needed to be everywhere the King and the Princess of Wales couldn't be, and stepped into that gap almost without being asked. She absorbed engagements, she covered ceremonial duties, she traveled, she showed up, and then, in June of that year, she was involved in an incident near her home at Gatcombe Park, believed to have been kicked or knocked by a horse, that left her hospitalized with a concussion and minor injuries serious enough that she reportedly has no memory of what happened. She was sidelined for weeks, and she still finished the year as the hardest working member of the family. That is not a coincidence, and it is not simply a personality quirk. People who have studied the modern monarchy closely tend to describe Anne's role in almost structural terms. She is less a star of the institution than its infrastructure. Ingrid Seward, the longtime editor of Majesty magazine and a veteran royal biographer, has spent years documenting exactly this dynamic. The royals who generate headlines are rarely the ones holding the institution together day to day. The people who show up to the agricultural conference, the regimental dinner, the charity gala, with no cameras and no fanfare, are the ones the family actually depends on when a crisis hits. In 2024 and 2025, that dependency became visible in the numbers themselves. What makes 2025 different from the 2 years before it is not that and slowed down. She sped up, but that the people she had spent 2 years covering for started coming back. Kate's return has been one of the most closely watched and most carefully managed comebacks in recent royal history. She announced in early 2025 that she was in remission, and from there her public life rebuilt itself in visible, deliberate stages. Trooping the color marked one of her first major returns to formal public duty by the autumn state visits. For the French president, the American president, and the German president, she and Prince William were positioned as the first royals to greet each visiting head of state, a signal, whether intentional or not, that the institution was placing renewed weight on her presence. Her total for the year came to 69 engagements, a 423% increase over the 13 she managed in 2024. It is still a fraction of what Anne or Charles carried that year, but measured against where she started, it is one of the most dramatic single-year increases the court circular has recorded for any senior royal in recent memory. Charles, for his part, did something almost the opposite of what illness typically does to a person's public commitments. Rather than retreating, he expanded, visiting Italy, Canada, and Poland over the course of the year, alongside his full domestic schedule, all while continuing weekly treatment. He announced toward the end of 2025 that his doctors had cleared him to scale back treatment in the new year, attributing the progress to early detection and consistent care. It was, by any measure, a hopeful note to end a difficult 2 years on. And it was Charles's own surge in engagements, nearly 50% higher than the year before, that finally pushed him past his sister in the annual count, ending her run at the top for the first time in 4 years. And when asked how she felt about losing the title she'd held for so long, did what she has done for most of her adult life. She said almost nothing and kept working. Her first engagement of 2026 came within the first week of January, when she attended the Oxford Farming Conference, an event she has supported for years as its honorary president and patron. Days before that, she issued a rare public statement. Rare not because she avoids public life, but because she avoids public sentiment, preferring action to reflection, reflecting on the difficulties of the previous year through her role as president of the Carers Trust, the charity supporting Britain's unpaid caregivers. It's a fitting patronage for her, in a strange way, and has effectively spent the better part of 2 years functioning as the family's own unpaid carer, filling in wherever illness, treatment, and recovery left gaps that needed covering, without asking for the recognition that comes with the word. She marked her 75th birthday in August of 2025, and the royal family's own social media tribute, posted by the palace's communications team, described her simply as having one of the busiest working schedules of any member of the royal family, noting her significant, ongoing relationships with charities and organizations across the Commonwealth. It is a quietly remarkable thing to be true of a woman well past the age most people retire, that after 56 years of official duty, beginning with her very first engagement in 1969 at the age of 18, meeting Welsh soldiers, she remains not a ceremonial figurehead but an operational one, someone the institution structurally relies on rather than simply displays. What this 2-year period reveals, more than any single ceremony or headline could, is how the modern monarchy actually survives moments of real vulnerability. There was no formal announcement of an stepping up. There was no declaration, sealed or otherwise, naming her the family's crisis manager. There was simply a gap, created by two of the most senior working royals facing cancer simultaneously, and a woman in her 70s who filled it day after day without complaint, without commentary, and largely without public acknowledgement until researchers added up the numbers at the end of the year, and the scale of what she'd done became impossible to ignore. And there was, running alongside her, a younger woman doing something quieter, and in some ways harder, rebuilding a public life almost from nothing, in full view of a country that had spent a year anxious about whether she would be able to return at all. Neither of these stories needed embellishment. The real numbers do the work themselves. A king who increased his public schedule while undergoing